I'm Nicolai Foss. I'm a professor at Copenhagen Business School, and I'm also the head of department of the Department of Strategic Management and Globalization. And I'm here today to talk to my colleague, Dr. Wolfgang Sofka, about some recently published research of his. This is a paper that is titled MNC Subsidiary Closures, What is the Value of Employees' Human Capital in New Jobs? It's just been published in the Journal of International Business Studies. This is joint work with Miguel Torres Preto and Pedro de Faria. And it's worth mentioning, I suppose, that the Journal of International Business Studies is the international business field's leading journal and is generally seen as an A journal. So first of all, many congratulations, Wolfgang, with your recent publication.
Thank you very much.
So let me turn to the first question. So this is a paper that addresses the consequences of employees of subsidiaries when those subsidiaries actually close down. And the employees as a result are, to use the technical term that you apply, displaced. Can you first give us an indication of the broader economic and social significance of this phenomenon?
Yes, the problem sounds a bit technical, but in essence, I think everybody can relate to news about a foreign firm closing down a firm or subsidiary in a country. And then we see a lot of media attention. We see protests, we see a lot of disruption in the employees' individual careers, their families. Sometimes it's necessary to move whole regions, whole regional economies. This is a very negative event, and we're not taking anything away from these effects. What we want to do with this paper is to say, but the employees are staying, and whatever made them good employees for the multinational will also make them very valuable contributors to their new firm, their hiring firm, which most of the time is a national firm.
So can you give us some specific examples of firms that have closed down subsidiaries with massive layoffs or displacements as a consequence?
Yes, typically these are not rare events. So if a multinational would open up a subsidiary today, there's a chance that, a 20% chance that it will not see its fifth birthday. And then when we think about examples, obviously in Denmark, probably the R&D center of Nokia here in Copenhagen would be the biggest example, involving several hundred skilled engineers, skilled scientists, yes, who have been released. But this is not an exception. We could think of Merck, the pharmaceutical company, closing down an important operation in the southern Netherlands. But even in the US, we see media reports, companies like logistics firm DHL closing down a whole logistics center in the middle of Pennsylvania, and we see again people lining the streets searching for new jobs. When we discuss the issue, there's typically in every country one of these hot button examples that people can relate to.
Right, but your data are Portuguese and not American or Danish. So why Portugal?
Well, we think Portugal is a very good setting to do this. It's a country that has entered the European Union and as a result has benefited a lot from new firms being established as a result of foreign direct investment. But then with a lot of competition, both from the Eastern European member states of the European Union, but also from locations like China, we see also a lot of these closure events. So even if in this 5-year time window that we're looking at, we see that more than 8,000 employees are affected by this displacement. So it's not a small number.
Mm-hmm. But in actuality, there may be substantial benefits of these displacements for the economy. Is that right? Is that a correct interpretation of your research?
Maybe it goes a bit too far. Yeah. So we wouldn't wish people to be displaced by their employer per se, whether it's a foreign employer or not.
Right. So the assumption is that they are basically in the best use of their human capital. Then they are displaced.
That's exactly the point. So that's the idea, that the best use of the knowledge that you acquire, the skills that you develop, is literally within the environment in which it was developed. And probably we can all relate to our own business environments. We learn a lot of things, and when we have to change this context, some of them just depreciate.
Right.
That does not mean that a foreign firm cannot be different, right? It gives its employees opportunities that they would not have in a domestic firm, such as access to international technology, dealing with international clients, maybe just the opportunity to develop skills like leading an international team that would not be possible if you just work for your local company next door.
Absolutely. So there may in actuality be substantial spillover benefits.
Exactly.
Of these kind of displacements.
At this point, what we're looking at, even in more precise terms, is the valuation of this experience in their new jobs, and that's basically the salary in their new job. So that's what we want to explain.
So you look at you approximate the value of employees' human capital in new jobs by means of their salaries.
That's right.
So can you tell us something about the conditions under which you expect the wages of former subsidiary employees to be higher in their new employment?
Mm-hmm. So what I have said right now sounds like it's all a very positive story, right? Yes. These displaced employees should always earn more. Of course, if we turn tables and we put ourselves into the heads of their new employers, maybe they could have doubts. Is this knowledge, are these skills something that will be useful to my local company? And we could think of ways in which this knowledge, these skills are not fitting. Maybe the multinational was rather bureaucratic, had a very different culture. Maybe I don't have the same suppliers and customers, so I'm not benefiting from any of this knowledge. This drives our theoretical thinking. Mm-hmm. In essence, what we are suggesting, every time a new employer will see signals for this value that the firm can gain from hiring this particular group of people, they will set a higher wage. Every time they have doubts that the knowledge will be valuable, they will set a lower wage.
Right, and what are those conditions on which, say, the value of the human capital may be lower?
Yes, so I want to pick just two because the paper has a total of 5, but maybe some of the most intriguing ones are, first of all, you would think of the closure as a failure of a firm, right? It was not successful enough, and that would be true for most domestic firms, but for a foreign subsidiary, that may not be true, because this subsidiary could have been closed because it was compared to other opportunities, let's say in China. That means what is relevant for the company that hires is the benchmark of the domestic economy. And within this domestic economy, this closed subsidiary may still have been very successful, very productive. And so what we're saying is that this provides a signal for the value of the employees.
Right, so in principle, you probably should have controlled for the reasons for closing down a subsidiary?
That's true. We can to a certain degree, but of course we know a lot about the employees. We know a lot about their operations in the country. And of course the exact decision-making process within the multinational is just difficult to do when at the same time you want to have a generalizable result across different industries, across different multinationals. What we can do, and I think that relates a bit to your question and goes back to our theoretical framework, is this idea that not all subsidiaries are created equal. So some will be rather minor investments, maybe in the form of a joint venture. Others will be fully owned, right? So really what we think is 100% owned captive investment of a foreign firm. Mm-hmm. And of those, there are also plenty. And what we are suggesting, what we are theorizing is that for a new employer, it's good to have substantial amounts of foreign investment so that the employee had a chance to acquire these international skills. At the same time, if it's a fully owned foreign subsidiary or was a fully owned foreign subsidiary, then that knowledge, these skills may be too specific to this particular context of this multinational that has later closed it down. We find this...
Sorry, may I interrupt you here
sure.
and ask, what is the relation between fully owned on the one hand and, say, full specificity of human capital?
Right.
What's the logic here?
The logical link would be that a mixed ownership would provide, actually just by the intention, why would you like to have a national partner, a domestic partner on board as a multinational? Essentially for providing inputs, especially local knowledge, that the foreign firm does not possess. Right. So that means within this subsidiary, we would expect a mix of exposure, both to the multinational as well as to the host country. In a 100% owned foreign subsidiary, that's not necessary, right? It's clear that the control and the coordination will be done by the global headquarters, and whoever works there will be fully exposed to these rules. Also, to give you then just a number, because we also find within our data the kind of optimal tipping point after which this relationship turns negative, and that's at 70%, exactly, it's even at 69, which gives at least us a lot of confidence. So it has to be more than 50, right? There should be something to be gained. It doesn't have to be 100, but there is a point after which a new employer looks at the situation and says, that's not us, right? This experience comes from a foreign firm. We do not have this culture. We have a lot of doubts that it will be valuable for us.
Right. So while some exposure to foreign management principles and business models and ideas and rules and procedures and so on, it's good. Too much is bad for the value of human capital. So specificity, too much specificity drives down the wages in the new employment. Is a hypothesis.
Yes.
And so what do you find overall?
In essence, what we find is kind of a risk profile. So who has the highest risks of significantly lower wages when he or she is affected by displacement? And probably the most straightforward results, also it sounds a bit simplistic, is the highest risk from displacement is displacement from a strictly domestic firm. Right? So whenever we see that these foreign firms get a lot of media attention, that does not reflect the consequences for the employees. Mm-hmm. And then when we look within the group of displaced employees of foreign firms, we can relatively easily describe somebody who is better off. So this person has worked for a highly productive subsidiary. We already talked about it. This subsidiary was kind of a mix between domestic control and foreign control. He or she were in a managerial role, so that gave them the opportunity to acquire this special human capital in practice. And, which is also, I think, a nice story, they have not been with the multinational for too long. So tenure would be an indication for culturation in a culture that is not the one of the host country. And this could be an indication for friction. And if you want to turn the risk profile around, then the high risk profiles are exactly the employees that do not have these characteristics.
Right. Extremely interesting. And these, your hypotheses are tested against a massive Portuguese data set, which contains what exactly?
It's, so for us it was very important to have the relevant reference group, and I think right. You're alluding to this. Yes. Because of course, you're doing better if there's no displacement in your biography, right? But that's not what we want to test. We want to get to this point of what is the foreign part of the displacement. So we get access to, based on Portuguese social security data, to all displaced employees in Portugal. So this would be 110,000 between 2004 and 2009. And more than 8,000 of those were displaced from a multinational firm. That allows us to do these comparisons. It also provides us with a rich opportunity to rule out a lot of other potential other explanations, because we know the biography of these people. Social security is mandatory in Portugal, so we have also a broad coverage. We are not limited to certain sectors or certain employees. I should also say that, of course, this is possible because my co-authors, Miguel Torres Preto is a labor market expert for Portugal. My co-author Pedro de Faria from the University of Groningen is an expert on multinationals and knowledge flows from multinationals. So it was not just an empirical opportunity, it was also, but it was also a theoretical opportunity to bring the perspectives together.
So speaking of the theoretical opportunities and implications of your research, what do you see as the main consequences for the two fields that you mainly draw on, namely labor economics and international business?
That's right. Our own driving force was a contribution to international business literature, which is quite rich in this idea that countries should attract foreign direct investment to benefit from this, and not just directly, but also through spillovers to domestic firms. But then when we look at the empirical results, that's hardly there. It's mixed at best. And the explanation is typically that either the multinational does not allow these spillovers to happen, or the domestic firms cannot absorb what is being offered to them. And now we are putting a situation forward here in which these two conditions do not hold. Right? So there's a rich pool of human capital being released to the host country in a format in which it should be the easiest to absorb because you can hire the carrier of the knowledge. And we have some examples, for example, from a pharmaceutical firm that was specialized in generics, was able to hire some of these employees of a closed down pharmaceutical R&D center from a US firm, and was able to manage then the shift to producing more original pharmaceutical products. So this is what we would like to see. The channel itself, to us, is novel for the international business literature. Also, it could be one that is quite large. It's not isolated events. When we think, if I can just add to the labor economics literature, because our topic is at the intersection, there the foreign ownership is typically just something to control for. Right. I think what our findings show is that the relationship between having worked or being displaced from a foreign firm and the future career opportunities is much more nuanced, right? So these experiences that employees make are much more nuanced, as evidenced by our hypothesis. So it matters which foreign subsidiary, it matters in what role you were and for how long you were working there.
Yeah. Do you think there's in general a broader opportunity for international business research to draw on registered data like you do? Is this something that is underexploited?
Actually, we think so, because you can imagine this is not just an isolated paper, it's supposed to lead to a research program in that direction. And at the moment we look at the outcomes from the individuals, but the logical next step is to look at the outcomes for firms as such, which requires that we can trace exactly where they end up being hired eventually. And that's a huge opportunity for registered data, because it provides us not just with this identification of a closure event, but also what happens afterwards. And of course, we look broader at empirical opportunities. The registered data for now is the most promising route.
Right. Well, as a final point, perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on the implications for decision makers, broadly conceived of your research, policymakers, as well as top managers in firms.
Right. So that goes back to this question of individual risk profiles. So I think for the individuals, whether they are top managers or just scientist managers within working for multinational firms, in general, our research shows that if you have been working there for a long time, the subsidiary is not highly productive, so your risk profile is relatively high. And especially if it's a fully owned foreign subsidiary, there's a lot of value in creating links with the host country environment. Mm-hmm. That could be a professional association, something like this. Turning this around for somebody who has a relatively low risk profile, this may not be a priority. For policymakers, we see quite active policymaking once the event has happened, especially from municipalities, because they are hit quite hard. What our results should allow them is having very targeted placement services. For some employees, that can just be communicating what they can bring to another firm, to potential new employers. For other employees, it may even require training, right? Training for putting the things that they were able to acquire from the multinational into a productive use for domestic firms, or at least translating them. And then we could also say what comes from the targeting. We can also identify a group of employees which should have relatively little problems finding a new well-paying job, and they would require just less help from the government.
Right, thanks a lot for sharing your research results with me and with the viewers on business. Sure, this has the potential to be impactful research. Hope you'll draw a lot of sites, and you may even have some policy research, so thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening and viewing.